Shay,
Anna.
I think it's time.
Oh, time for what?
Time for me to make a confession.
Okay, here we are.
Here it is. So many years ago, I had a secret life. A secret life as an assessment specialist.
Wow, I mean, that was quite the intro for what you actually just shared after. A secret life as an assessment specialist.
Yeah, not so secret, I suppose, not so cool. But I mean, assessment was really what launched my career in TESOL. I taught a little right out of college, but then I dove right into a role at ETS, Educational Testing Service, developing the TOEFL and TOEIC tests for 4 years before coming back to teaching again. And then I continued writing test items for them part-time and was the assessment specialist at Fordham University's intensive English program, where I was also teaching.
And you met me.
Yes, of course. It's like my favorite puzzle. Designing assessment is just great.
Well, it can be, but not all teachers have a fondness for assessment like you do, Anna.
True.
So today we thought we'd unpack that relationship a little. The relationship between teachers and assessment, specifically classroom assessment.
Buckle up and get your nerd caps on.
Hello, and welcome to the Teacher Think-Aloud podcast, a podcast for reflective practice for teachers of English around the world. I'm your co-host, Shey.
And I'm Anna.
So, Anna, we put out a poll on social media before recording this episode, asking listeners what the word assessment elicits for them.
Is it more of a meh, yuck, or woohoo?
And we actually got a couple of woohoos on
we did.
Instagram and Twitter, as well as some mehs. But amazingly, no yucks.
I was surprised, honestly. Nobody expressed a serious aversion to assessment. And we also got some interesting responses in the chat. On Twitter, a few folks got into a discussion about whether high-stakes assessments are even needed in education. I think the consensus was students do need a little bit of pressure to perform, right? So as long as the assessments are appropriate.
Yeah, that was a fun discussion to follow. I particularly liked a comment from Erin, who was a teacher turned instructional coach who now works at Swivel, an ed tech company promoting reflection and teacher development. She made an important distinction. She wrote, "Define assessment. I love a good low-stakes, fun, formative assessment to gather data. I do not love high-stakes, standardized, traditional assessments."
Oh my gosh, yes.
Same.
That is the heart of the issue here. I remember when I worked at ETS, when someone would ask me, like a teacher would ask me what I do, I was like, I work at ETS, I write assessments, and everyone hated me. I would kind of try to hide it, because people were not fans.
Yeah, no, it's true. I think that you have a very different relationship with assessment than many teachers I've met. I mean, assessment is kind of scary, especially when we're talking about big standardized tests like TOEFL and IELTS. But I personally have sort of come around to assessment now. Yeah, I sort of had an aha moment, like, well, I need to change the way I think about assessment or I'm going to be a really miserable teacher.
Interesting. I think a lot of teachers just think of large-scale tests, standardized tests as assessment. And a lot of times those standardized tests are imposed on them and they have no choice and they feel like they're teaching to the test.
Yeah.
They're forced to do it. But okay, I'm going to go off on a little tangent here.
Okay, I'm ready.
Large-scale tests do have a place, in my opinion, despite all of the equity issues and all the stuff that needs to be worked through in that field. Standardized testing actually came about as a tool for equity because people were just kind of paying their way into college. I'm thinking of the SAT here, the college admissions test in the United States. The SAT came about because the only people allowed into college were rich people. And then with the test, at least, they were able to remove any identifying features like you come from such and such family and have a slightly more objective way of admitting students. It was an attempt to expand access.
Attempt being the key word here, right?
Yeah. Obviously, we know now that that's not how it works. It's a much deeper system of how the inequities exist within testing.
Right. And not to mention that teachers are penalized for their students' performance on these standardized tests. And, you know, in the United States, at least, state and federal funding is often tied to performance and outcomes on these tests. So it's not wild that some teachers dread assessment or dread standardized assessment because there are real life negative implications for not teaching to the test, not preparing your students.
But like that whole penalty, I think the big issue, the reason that teachers are feeling penalized is often that test scores are linked to their employment or the funding that they get or their school gets. And the thing is also often the tests don't really reflect what really makes sense in their classroom, right? Like how students are showing their knowledge, their skills, right? How the tests are often, you know, there are often some design flaws in terms of whether we can use this one yardstick to represent how students are doing. So, I mean, that's an issue of validity that we'll bring up later, but it's something that, you know, when standardized test companies and government agencies think of how they're going to serve the teachers in their state and their country on an international scale, they need to think about that. And often there's a loss of that input from teachers that can make standardized testing more of a positive experience that actually reflects students' abilities and skill sets, that would reflect the real learning happening in the classroom and show the good work that teachers have been doing.
So yeah, that's standardized testing, but large-scale testing is just one part of this, right? Classroom assessment is just a whole other beast, and that's what we're talking about today. So in a classroom setting, what teachers think of when the word assessment comes up might often be these big summative assessments, like midterm and final exams and stuff, possibly mandated from the department or the institution they work in, right? And we might even associate these types of summative assessment with standardized assessment because of how high stakes they can be.
Yeah, but from what you said earlier, like when you sort of changed and embraced assessment, I'm guessing you had like some kind of switch in your understanding of what assessment means.
Totally. I mean, assessment is just, well, it's everything. It's everything that we do as teachers. We can't fully tease apart teaching and assessment and learning. They're so interdependent and intertwined.
Right.
You know, assessment can mean participating in class, having a discussion with peers. It can be, you know, really brief in-class quizzes or even exit tickets. Homework is a form of assessment. And so here is where the idea of formative assessment comes in. So yeah, these ideas, these standardized tests, midterms and finals, these are all sort of massive summative assessments, right? And those do have their place, but in classroom assessment, the core really is formative assessment.
Absolutely. So let's define summative versus formative assessment. To me, it's kind of like a sliding scale, honestly. Summative means that this test is used just for a final evaluation of some kind. It doesn't necessarily have any impact on the learning process. Whereas formative is very much informing the learning process, informing teachers on what they should do next. But my argument is that even though there are some assessments that, you know, exist as summative assessments only, I think any summative assessment can also be a formative assessment in that it's, if it's used properly, if we're thinking of that assessment as a learning tool, we're going to use it to help students understand their own gaps, areas for improvement, right? Like if there's a big midterm, we're not just going to be like, oh, you did, X number on the midterm and move on.
Right. Well, hopefully not.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, we'll review it with the students. We may have introduced the rubric for the midterm assignment previously to them so that they could then analyze their own work, stop and reflect. To me, if there's no formative component to that midterm, if it's just sort of one and done, that's really just an example of a teacher, giving an assessment because they have to, because they have to have some sort of numerical measure of learning to document. But that's not actually helpful to a student when there's no follow-up.
Right. And from assessment, teachers can make decisions about where to go on the student's learning journey, on what the appropriate follow-up should be.
Yeah.
If the assessment is well designed to capture, the learning that should have taken place over the course of that period of time, it's indicative of how well the teacher did in explaining something or whether they need to go spend more time on something before moving on, right?
Yeah. So assessments, they're not just looking at what our students have taken away from our lessons, what they've learned, but it's also really critical feedback on our work, on our efficacy as teachers.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it totally reveals a lot and informs your teaching. And so with this idea that teaching and assessment and learning are so intertwined, there's a point that our listeners, Heather and Edge, whose podcast English as a Singing Language, you should definitely check out.
Check it out.
They commented on our audience question this week and said that their reaction to the word assessment, quote unquote, is definitely woohoo, right? In their words, creating a well-designed assessment as an instructor and taking one as a student are both incredibly enjoyable and satisfying activities.
I love that. It really speaks to the importance of thinking carefully about how assessment fits into instruction.
Yeah. And when it comes to assessment design, there are a couple of big terms, principles of assessment design that we need to think about. The first principle is validity. I mean, honestly, that one to me is the most important principle because validity basically means I am measuring what I say I'm measuring. You're not going to measure students' ability to speak on a topic by having them fill in the blank on a listening exercise. Like, it's really not getting at the construct that you're measuring.
Right. So we're designing assessments so that they actually reflect what we want our students to be able to do.
Yeah. The second one is authenticity, which is we want the task to be as close to the target language use domain as possible. In other words, the context in which they're going to use the language.
Right.
Like I have this example here. Which of these two, Shey, is more authentic?
Uh-oh. I'm being assessed right now. Are you assessing my knowledge, Anna?
No,
is this a test?
Just something to get us thinking.
Okay,
so which is more authentic? In an English-speaking course, a role play of a phone call between customer and customer service representative to test speaking skills in transactional phone conversations.
Okay, so far so good.
Okay. Or second option, in an academic writing course, a multiple choice gap fill task in which students must select the appropriate tense to test students' ability to use tense. Which one's more authentic?
Well, I'd have to go with the first one. I mean, it's clear. It's the exact context, right? It's something students might actually have to do outside of the classroom.
Exactly. Yeah.
So it's absolutely authentic. Whereas in an academic writing course, your students, filling in the blank or completing multiple choice activities, like, you don't do that in real life, do you?
But see, that's the thing also, like authenticity. You can't just go for 100% authenticity many times. You have to balance it with the next concept, which is reliability. So reliability is more about whether there's consistency in measurement. For example, two students take the same test. One of them is an advanced learner. One of them is an intermediate learner. The advanced learner should be doing better on that test than the intermediate learner. There should be some very clear pattern in terms of where they fall. We can rely on the results. So with authenticity, like very authentic tasks, they're harder to measure reliably, right?
Yeah, the more authentic, the more gray area there is.
Yeah. So we kind of need to find that balance, which is why sometimes a gap fill or even a multiple choice question, which is super inauthentic, but way more reliable, that's why these less authentic tasks do have their place in assessment design. If we let them write whatever they want to write, they might just not even use the tense and avoid it completely. So we might not be able to measure it at all, right?
Right, yeah. All of these forms of assessment have their place, I think, especially when they're used strategically and follow a logical progression in instruction. I mean, having students choose the appropriate tense is a helpful drill. It's helpful to reinforce understanding of the different tenses, right? So that will then feed into their ability to write, an academic essay in the writing course using those tenses accurately. So it's about building blocks. That's why we're really thinking of this in terms of formative assessment, right? Thinking about how assessment can be used to further knowledge rather than simply display knowledge.
Yeah. And then here's one that I think teachers really connect with. It's practicality.
Oh man, this is a good one for me right now. So within my new teaching context, I'm teaching students remotely who are from China. And I have a total of 365-ish students who I teach business reading skills to in what is essentially a lecture format.
That is so awkward.
Can you imagine my face just being projected in multiple lecture halls at once?
Yikes.
Yeah, yikes is right. So, well, everything's awkward about this situation, but there are so many challenges here. The way the course is set up, there's no way for me to change that. Ultimately, I've had free rein in designing the course and the outcomes and assessment. And, homework is such an important form of assessment to me. In any context, I think there needs to be practice outside of the class setting. And with 365 students, and because my teaching context is in China, any of the forms of assessment that would be practical in the US for a group this large, like a Google survey that automatically grades itself, or many of the other tools I'm used to using for large-scale formative assessment, just don't work in China.
Right.
So
yeah,
it's been really hard to come up with valid, authentic, reliable, and practical assessment that I can use in this teaching context. I've really just been racking my brain.
Yeah, I mean, that's so challenging. The tech tools are a huge part of practicality. We can't spend like hours and hours and hours creating some magical online assessment. We're teachers. We only have so much time. So we need to, at some point make a decision of the extent to which we can spend all this time designing X, Y, and Z assessment.
For sure.
So we really need to be realistic with ourselves. Like one thing that for me, when I've worked on assessment with teachers abroad, is a lot of times their assessment is prescribed from the top down and they only have so much wiggle room. So we have to find ways to build in the validity, authenticity, and reliability within the limits of the school structure.
Another example is, one time that I did teach a reading class in person, and I gave a final exam, both a midterm and a final. And of course, there were other forms of assessment throughout. And I had the students complete this written exam, which, it was my first time giving the exam. And I thought, oh, this is totally feasible in a 2-hour class session. But by the end of the session, my students were just Their eyes were glazed over. They were so mad at me. And they were like, Prof. Shey, like, I can't possibly do this in, 2 hours. This is a 4-hour exam.
Oh.
It broke my heart. I mean, needless to say, I felt awful. Yeah. And I ended up making part of it take home, another part of it extra credit. And all of that to say that that's why we have formative assessment and how it can be really helpful. This idea of continuous assessment, because we can't just cram everything that we want to assess into one big written exam and expect students to just like step up to the plate. That's unfair.
Oh, I think you're raising a really good point. Another example, if we assign just like a big final paper and the students haven't written anything related to that paper until that point, it's just like, that's just not a manageable way to practice assessment. I mean, for a real classroom assessment to take place, break it down into smaller assessments. Like, why do you need this giant midterm or final besides the fact that your department is requiring it of all teachers? What if you do like a little quiz that takes little pieces of what's going to be that final or midterm exam or whatever, a little quiz every week, and make sure that the students have a chance to look at that and you get to look at their responses and decide if you need to go over something again. Break it down.
Yeah, it just makes me think of how, well, I've tried so many different assessments over the years, naturally. Fortunately, I've had the freedom in my teaching for the most part to dictate what my syllabus says. And so I've had, in a few classes, I did sort of that formative assessment throughout in the form of like little quizzes or weekly homework assignments or whatever that eventually built up. And in the end, students as a group created this class study guide where we looked at, students were able to look at the areas that they were weaker in and for themselves be able to figure out what they needed to spend more of their time preparing for this final project that I was having them do. And so formative assessment can be, incredibly enlightening, not only for you, but for your students as well.
Absolutely. I love the reflective component that you built into that. And that
I'll always try.
and that really is to me what defines the formative aspect of that. It's not just the teacher taking the data and shifting gears, but also the students being able to recognize what's going on and have that metacognitive reflection on their own progress.
And students are not used to that, though. Many students won't think of assessment as an opportunity for reflection.
It takes some work, yeah.
They'll look at it as, well, they'll take it as a slap on the wrist. It's like, oh, now I need to punish myself for what I didn't know.
Oh, no.
No, we don't want that. So I hope that teachers, our listeners, might feel inspired to reframe how they think about assessment and how they can share, the beauty of assessment with their students. I can't believe I just said that.
Love it. Man. The beauty of assessment.
There's a record now.
One final note before we sign off for today, coming back to this idea of equity. This is a problematic thing at the standardized test level because they're often out of touch, right, with what students can actually do and how it manifests. But in terms of classroom assessment, this is where I think alternative assessments become important to think about. A lot of the history of assessment is designed after like IQ tests and like very specific ways of measuring intelligence, very specific ways of evaluating student success, of evaluating whether a student has studied and learned. But there's this cross-cultural component, right, of like different cultures, whether they're multicultural within a single context like the US, or it's just a completely different culture in a different place, the kinds of tasks, the ways that students can show their learning is different, right? And so working in project-based learning, for example, like we've talked about before.
That's episode 27, listeners.
Or working in more portfolio type work, right?
We've also talked about deadlines and having deadlines that are less,
rigid.
Less rigid, more human deadlines. And then designing the test, thinking about the authenticity in the context of who the students are as well. And that means creating when you have the ability to do so, taking into consideration who you have in front of you and what relationships they have established with assessment as a concept, and building assessment that recognizes them, the learners, and reminds them that they're not just the numbers that they score, right? And that intelligence is such a vast concept.
And also that not all classroom assessment needs to have a number associated with it.
So, on that note, listeners, we're going to pause our discussion here. Of course, there's so much we haven't touched upon in this discussion. We're pacing ourselves. We'll need to do an episode on rubrics for sure. And we're hoping to do an episode on the book and phenomenon ungrading, hopefully soon.
Yeah, lots to look forward to. But in the meantime, please tell us, what is your relationship to assessment? How do you balance validity, authenticity, reliability, and practicality as a teacher? How do you make formative assessment truly valuable for your students?
You can join the conversation on our various social media accounts. Email us via our contact form at teacherthinkaloud.com or comment via Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, or YouTube. We welcome your reflections, questions, and ideas.
And also, we'd like to ask for your help. We're working on a new episode format.
So exciting.
Where we integrate lots of different voices of our listeners from around the world.
We've got a set of questions we'd like to invite you to answer in a short audio recording that you will send to us to be featured on a future episode. We want to know who you are, where you are, what you do, your strengths and challenges, and something unique about your teaching context. We want to use this as an opportunity to peer into the lives of educators across the globe.
Check out our questions on our social media pages on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. You can submit your answers by joining our Friends of the Podcast WhatsApp chat at bit.ly/pod_friends, or by writing to us directly on social media or via email. We're so eager to learn about you, members of this community of practice.
Thanks so much for joining us on the Teacher Think Aloud podcast. And until next time, happy teaching
and happy reflecting.